So today we're going to talk about a new civilization and their oldest poetry. Today I want to introduce you to the Rig Veda, which is the oldest of the holy books from India and the Indian civilization. The language that these hymns and poems are written in is Sanskrit. Now, just like the Sumerian and Egyptian poetry we've talked about, it's difficult to date these poems and these hymns to an exact, July 3rd, 1900 BC. We can't quite do that, but we can look at the linguistic history and see when were people writing and speaking in this kind of language. And so, as I've said before, I'm not a historian, but the historians I've been looking at seem to think that the Rig Veda was probably composed in the versions that we have of it sometime in the second half of the second millennia BC, so sometime between 1500 and 1000 BC. But it's possible that the oral traditions that these are based on go back hundreds, maybe even thousands of years before. There's one tradition in Hinduism that I came across that says that the Rig Veda was probably first composed about 4000 BC. But the manuscripts we have that have these poems in them seem to be from the second half of the second millennia BC. Now, we talked about in Sumerian and Egyptian poetry primarily characters and perspectives of writers. So heroes, the ways that priests or holy men or women interacted with the gods and talked about them. But it's with the Rig Veda that we begin to get in the history of literature interest in the syllabic patterns and metrical patterns of the language that hymns, both religious and poetry that's either religious or not, are being written in. Now, the first hymn that we have in the Rig Veda, which is made up of many, many hymns to largely Agni, who was the god of fire in Hindu tradition, but also other gods. The first hymn that we get is written in a very short meter that apparently is considered to be the most lofty and holy of the meters, and this is called Gayatri. Now, a Gayatri meter is a type of poetry that's written in 3-line stanzas, and each line is 8 syllables long. Now, similar to the Greek poetry and the Roman poetry that's going to develop after Indian poetry, the Indian writers were very interested in creating repeating patterns of long and short vowel sounds throughout their poetry. Stress, like accented syllables, unaccented syllables, was probably there in the language, but it wasn't focused on when it comes to the patterns. So I'm going to read to you the first hymn from the Rig Veda. Now, this has been translated into English lines of 8 syllables, and see if you can discern the rhythm that's going on in it. I laud Agni, the chosen priest, God, minister of sacrifice, the Hotar, lavishest of wealth. Worthy is Agni to be praised, by living as by ancient seers. He shall bring hitherward the gods. Through Agni man obtaineth wealth. Yea, plenty waxing day by day, most rich in heroes glorious. Agni, the perfect sacrifice, which thou encompassest about, verily goeth to the gods. May Agni, sapient-minded priest, truthful, most gloriously great, the god, come hither with the gods. Whatever blessing, Agni, thou wilt grant unto thy worshipper, that Angiras indeed thy truth. To thee, dispeller of the night, O Agni, day by day with prayer, bringing thee reverence, we come, ruler of sacrifices, guard of law eternal, radiant one, increasing in thine own abode. Be to us easy of approach, even as a father is to his son. Agni, be with us for our weal. Now, this is a translation from about 100 years ago or more, and so we have some antiquated language like wheel, but it gives us a sense in English of the lofty speech. This is an address to the god Agni, and this is very reverent speech. If you heard in how it's translated and how I read it, there is a sort of lilt in each line. And this is due to the metrical requirements of the Gayatri meter. Now, a Gayatri meter, like I said, there's 3 lines in each stanza, and there's multiple stanzas. And each line had to end with 4 syllables that had a short, long pattern. Da 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 da. Now, in Sanskrit and in Greek and Latin, long and short vowel sounds are not the same as accented and unaccented syllables in English, but we can approximate them with our accented and unaccented meter in English. We've talked about this in previous videos. So I think the last stanza, be to us easy of approach, even as a father to his son, Agni be with us for our weal. We have some long stressed syllables in the opening lines, like Agni be with us for our weal. That da 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 is at the end of each line. And that is how the hearer of Sanskrit poetry would know, oh, this is an 8-syllable line and it ends with a da 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 pattern, so this must be the Gayatri meter. This works really well for an oral culture, because you don't have to see it written out and, count out the syllables. You can just hear the lilt of each line and know the meter that it's written in. In fact, they're developed in Vedic studies, which is the studies of the Rig Veda and later Vedas. They're developed in Vedic studies a whole discipline called Chandras. I may not be pronouncing that right, but in English it's spelled Chandras, Chandras. And it's a whole religious discipline that studies the metrical structures of Vedic poems. Now, as I mentioned, the Rig Veda, from which we just read, is the oldest of the Vedas. But there are other Vedas that were written after the Rig Veda that kind of carry on this tradition of paying attention to metrical structures and varying them. There's the 8-syllable lines that we looked at just now, but as the Vedas developed and as the tradition developed, poets started experimenting with new metrical structures in each line, and even putting in longer lines, some lines of 8 that then swell out to lines of 11 and back to 8 to create new patterns. Later Vedic writings, known as the Upanishads, are very mystical texts which are interested in questions of enlightenment, of the divine and human interaction in really beautiful ways. But this first Veda we looked at, I think it reminds me a lot of the kind of things that the Sumerian and the Egyptian poets were asking for. Be with us, give your power to us, let us be close to you. And there's this very tender moment that I want to finish by looking at the end, where it says, ruler of sacrifices, guard of law, eternal radiant one, increasing in thy own abode. Very lofty, right? This Agni is a very powerful god. Be to us easy of approach, even as a father to his son. Agni be with us for our weal. Just like in the Egyptian papyrus of Ani that we looked at, there's this asking for closeness, the asking for dearness from the divine. It's not just you're lofty up there and we're these little, groveling worms down here and there's a gulf between us which cannot be crossed. It's asking for a tenderness from the divine. I think I love this longing that we see in ancient poetry for this union, this sort of familial relationship between the suppliant who's praying and the divine that they're trying to interact with. Human life is hard, even in our sometimes over-pampered age. But these poems remind us that humans have always been interested in having succor from the divine, and maybe even having that relationship with the divine, one who's powerful, who is coming to help the lowly, maybe even spanning out into human society, that, the high and the low, the rich and the poor, the powerful and the disenfranchised could somehow become closer together, and there can be a union of humanity, a solidarity of humanity with one another and with the gods, which seems to be something that we're always striving for. If you're interested in this, check out the Rig Veda, check out how the poets who have translated these poems have tried to preserve the meter in English. There's a lot of richness to find there. Thanks so much.